Someone killed this man on purpose, left his most valuable possession sitting right next to his body, and then walked back down the mountain without ever looking back. And for 5,300 years, nobody knew his name, his face, or where his family really came from. Then a laboratory in Germany ran his DNA through a machine that didn't exist 10 years ago, and everything the world thought it knew about the most famous frozen corpse in human history turned out to be wrong. Not a little wrong, not slightly off. Wrong in a way that scientists had to run the same test 3 times before they would believe what the screen was telling them. The face in every museum, the man in every textbook, the image printed on millions of postcards sold at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology. That man never actually existed. The real one was stranger, older, and darker than anyone ever allowed him to be. And the deeper the science goes into who Ötzi the Iceman actually was, the more unsettling the story becomes. Because it turns out the biggest secret this 5,000-year-old murder victim was keeping wasn't how he died. It was where he came from. And the answer to that question rewrites not just his story, but the story of an entire continent. Let's go back to the beginning. September 1991. A married couple from Germany, Erika and Helmut Simon, are hiking through the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy. They step off the marked trail to save some time on their descent. And there, half submerged in meltwater at the edge of a receding glacier, they find what they assume is a dead mountaineer. A brownish shape, a shoulder, a head face down in the ice. They are not alarmed. Mountain accidents happen. They report it, and the local authorities send out a team to recover the body. Clumsy work follows. People pry at the figure with an ice pick. A drill gets involved. Nobody is being especially careful because everyone assumes this is a modern tragedy. It is not. The clothing scattered nearby is not Gore-Tex and nylon. It is leather and grass and hide stitched with sinew. The tools aren't aluminum. They are copper and flint and wood. By the time the experts arrive, the body has already been partially damaged in the extraction. But what remains is extraordinary beyond any measuring. This man has been lying in that gully, held perfectly by the glacier's cold, for somewhere between 5,200 and 5,300 years. He is older than the pyramids at Giza. He was alive when Stonehenge was still being planned. He walked those alpine slopes while writing was a brand new technology appearing only in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, thousands of miles to the east. And crucially, the glacier had not merely preserved his bones. It had preserved him, his skin, his organs, his stomach contents, not just the presence of food, but the specific species he had eaten, analyzed down to the plant pollen he had swallowed that afternoon. His clothing survived. A coat stitched from the hides of at least 4 different animals. Brown bear for the cap, deer for the leggings, goat for the coat itself, and cattle for a belt pouch. Shoes stuffed with grass for insulation that modern engineers studying his footwear have called more sophisticated than many modern hiking boots in terms of basic design principles. His weapons survived. A longbow he was still in the process of finishing, not yet ready to shoot. A quiver of arrows, most of them also unfinished, and his copper axe, a full-length hafted tool with a blade of almost pure copper, so rare and so valuable for the Copper Age that archaeologists immediately understood it as a status marker. This was not an anonymous wanderer. This was somebody. And then there were his tattoos, 61 of them, preserved in the dark lines of carbon rubbed into cuts in his skin. They cluster over his lower back, his knees, his ankles, his calves, precisely the joints where, thousands of years later, CT scanning would reveal severe arthritis and worn cartilage, the oldest tattoos in the world, and they appear to have been placed exactly where the pain was worst. The man was treating himself. He was his own doctor, using the medicine his world had. You look at that detail and you cannot help but feel it. The intimacy of a person managing their own suffering 5,000 years before aspirin. His name, of course, was not Ötzi. That is the nickname the media gave him, derived from the Ötztal Alps, where he was found. His real name is gone, but the man is not. And for more than 30 years, he has been one of the most studied human beings who ever lived. X-rayed, CT scanned, DNA sampled, radiocarbon dated, microscopically examined, reconstructed in wax and silicone, discussed in thousands of peer-reviewed papers. And out of all that study, a picture emerged, a picture that felt solid, reliable, complete. It showed a man of roughly 45 years of age, which was genuinely old for his era. A man with wavy brown hair, a full beard, pale, ruddy skin weathered by alpine sun and wind. A man who was unmistakably, centrally, completely European. He was found in Europe. He lived in Europe. His mitochondrial DNA connected to European lineages. The reconstruction in the museum dressed him accordingly. The iconic, almost heroic figure of a Copper Age mountain man who looked like he could have been someone's ancestor in any alpine village today. Millions of tourists pressed their faces against the refrigerated glass of his case in Bolzano and felt that recognition, that sense of meeting someone familiar from an impossibly remote past. That picture was wrong, and the way it was wrong tells you something deeply uncomfortable about how human beings fill in the blanks when science runs out of answers. Here's what happened. When Otzi was first discovered in 1991, the tools for reading ancient DNA barely existed. Scientists could extract only tiny fragments, the toughest, most resilient corners of the genome, specifically the mitochondrial DNA. The genetic material passed only through the female line, mother to daughter, unchanged for generations. That early reading placed his maternal line in a European grouping that seemed, at first pass, to confirm everything the physical evidence suggested. He was European. Done. But there was a problem nobody fully noticed at the time. His specific mitochondrial branch was vanishingly rare. When researchers went looking for living people who shared that same maternal signature, the cousins and distant relatives that every human being on Earth is supposed to have through the web of shared mitochondrial inheritance, they came back nearly empty-handed. His maternal line had almost no echo in the modern world. It appeared to have faded over the millennia to near extinction, thinning out until barely anyone alive today carried it. A recent updated analysis confirmed something even stranger. His paternal lineage, the Y chromosome passed from father to son, did not match any of the other 47 ancient individuals from the same alpine region who were tested in a landmark 2025 study published in Nature Communications. Not one match. In a community of people who were sharing the same mountains, the same farming traditions, the same Anatolian ancestry, Otzi's specific family line was unlike anyone else around him. His maternal line matches no known population in Europe, ancient or modern. He was genetically singular, a man from a lineage so isolated and so old that it left almost no trace in anyone who came after. Then came the 2012 genome. Using a sliver of bone drilled from his hip bone, a team generated the first complete ancient human genome ever sequenced at that level of detail. Revolutionary. It confirmed his blood type, type O. It told them he was lactose intolerant, unable to digest milk as an adult, a condition normal for nearly all humans, before a genetic mutation swept through European farming populations in the millennia that followed his death. It revealed a predisposition to cardiovascular disease, hardening of the arteries, written into his genes in a way that meant, even if he had not been shot, his heart may have eventually killed him. It even recovered DNA from a bacterium in his stomach, a strain of Helicobacter pylori, the microbe responsible for most stomach ulcers, whose particular genetic profile hinted at deep Asian origins. The 2012 genome also appeared to show traces of steppe ancestry in his blood, the genetic signature of the horse-riding herder peoples who had swept across Europe from the Caspian grasslands in the millennia after Otzi's death, reshaping the genetics of the entire continent. The finding slotted him neatly into the accepted story of European prehistory. Otzi, it seemed, carried a mix of the ancestries that made modern Europeans who they are: farmer, hunter-gatherer, and a hint of steppe herder. Understandable, expected, confirmed. Except none of that steppe ancestry was real. It was contamination. And it took a full decade, a new generation of sequencing technology, and a team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and URAC Research working together in 2023 to prove it. What they found when they resequenced Otzi's genome at higher coverage, using cleaner methods and a reference library of over 10,000 ancient individuals for comparison, was that the steppe signal had been an artifact. Modern DNA, stray molecules from technicians, handlers, and the chaotic early days of the extraction before proper protocols existed, had crept into the original sample and made him look more like a present-day European than he actually was. Stripped that contamination away, and what remained was something nobody expected. An ancestry profile so heavily weighted toward early Anatolian farmers, the people who had walked out of what is now Turkey and spread farming across Europe in the millennia before Otzi was born, that it was unlike any other contemporary European population ever tested. Between 80 and 90% of his ancestry came from those Anatolian farmers, almost none from the steppe, barely any from the hunter-gatherers who had lived in Europe before the farmers arrived. He was, in a sense, almost purely descended from one wave of migration, as though his community had lived for generations in a high alpine valley so isolated that the great churning mix of peoples happening across the rest of the continent had simply never reached them. A genetic island in the mountains, surrounded by change but untouched by it. And here is where the story pivots hard, because that cleaned-up, corrected ancestry reading had a second consequence that hit the scientific community like a slap. It changed his face. The 2023 resequencing looked at the genetic markers for physical appearance with fresh eyes. And what the genome said about his skin color stopped the lead researcher cold. The earlier reconstruction had given him pale, ruddy, weathered European skin, the complexion of someone who looked like the modern alpine people who found him. The corrected genome said his skin pigmentation was darker, considerably darker than modern southern Europeans, darker than modern Sicilians. The study's authors described it as one of the darkest skin pigmentation profiles ever recorded in a European individual from that period. And his hair, the flowing dark mane of the museum models, the wavy cascade framing that rugged, instantly recognizable face, the genome said that was wrong too. Genetic markers associated with male pattern baldness were clearly present. By the time he died, in his mid-40s, he was very likely bald or close to it. The man in the refrigerated case in Bolzano, staring out at millions of tourists through glass. The museum reconstruction hanging above him in the exhibition hall, with its full head of wavy hair and its pale, weathered complexion, had never actually existed. The real man looked like someone else entirely, someone older looking probably, as male pattern baldness tends to age a face, darker skinned, a face the world would not recognize from a single one of the 30 years of posters, textbooks, and documentaries. The July 2025 study from Nature Communications confirmed and deepened this picture by doing something no one had done before at that scale. It sequenced the genomes of 47 other prehistoric individuals who lived in the same alpine territory as Ötzi, spanning the period from 6400 BCE to 1300 BCE. The researchers wanted to know whether Ötzi's unusually pure Anatolian farmer ancestry made him an outlier or just a typical member of his community. The answer was complicated and astonishing in equal measure. Most of his neighbors shared the same high proportion of Anatolian farmer ancestry, between 80 and 90%. And like Ötzi, they had dark hair, dark eyes, and were lactose intolerant. The Alps during the Copper Age were populated by people who looked nothing like the pale northern Europeans the popular imagination tends to project backward onto ancient history. But here's the twist within the twist. When researchers compared the specific family lineages, the paternal Y chromosome and the maternal mitochondrial signatures, Otzi did not match anyone else in the group. His neighbors shared similar broad ancestry, but came from different specific family lines. Otzi's paternal and maternal lineages had no matches among the 47 individuals tested. He lived among people similar to him in many ways, but his specific family bloodline appears to have been unique in that community. A man of his people, but from a family unlike anyone else nearby. This detail matters enormously for the murder, because the murder is real, documented, forensically reconstructed to a standard that would satisfy a modern criminal court, and the new genetic picture changes how it reads. Here is what the forensics say. At some point in the days before he died, Ötzi was in a serious fight. His right hand shows deep cuts between the thumb and index finger. Classic defensive wounds, the kind you get when you grab the blade of a knife being swung at you. Those wounds were healing when he died, meaning the fight happened at least a day or two beforehand. Blood from 4 different individuals was found on his gear, 1 DNA profile on his knife blade, 2 on a single arrowhead in his quiver, consistent with the interpretation that he used that same arrow to wound or kill 2 people and then retrieved it, as fighters did in that era, a 4th blood profile on his coat. This was not a man who had been ambushed out of nowhere. This was a man who had been in a conflict, who had fought, possibly killed, who was moving through the mountains carrying other people's blood on his weapons, and then someone came up the slope behind him with a bow and shot him in the left shoulder from below and behind, at a distance, while he sat resting after what the stomach contents analysis shows was a large meal. He had eaten red deer, ibex, einkorn wheat, and wild vegetables. He was full. He was resting. He did not see it coming. The arrow severed his left subclavian artery. He bled to death within minutes, face down in the gully, alone. His copper axe sat untouched beside him. Whoever killed him did not want his wealth. They wanted him dead. Munich's chief inspector Alexander Horn, brought in by the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology to analyze the case using modern criminological methods, concluded that the killing bore all the hallmarks of personal conflict. Someone who knew Ötzi, who had a reason that was specific to Ötzi, who chose a long-distance ambush specifically to avoid another hand-to-hand fight with a man who had already proven dangerous enough to survive one. A targeted killing, a premeditated murder, 5,300 years old, and it reads like something ripped from a modern detective file. Now layer in what the corrected genome tells us about his community. A man from a genetically isolated family line in a tight, insular alpine valley. A community that had stayed isolated for generations while the world changed around it. Closed populations carry their resentments close. Grudges do not dissolve into an anonymous crowd when the crowd is small and everyone knows everyone else's bloodline. A man with Ötzi's profile, older, 45, in a world where that was genuinely old, carrying a copper axe that was a visible, obvious marker of standing and wealth, was not invisible in his community. He was known. The blood on his weapons suggests he had been known recently in ways that created enemies, and someone with access to a bow and the patience to follow him up a mountain made the decision that Ötzi needed to not come back down. We will never know the words that passed between them. We will never know the name of the person who came up that slope. But the corrected genome makes Otzi less of an anonymous, ancient everyman and more of a specific individual in a specific place, killed by someone who almost certainly sat across a fire from him at some point in their lives. Meanwhile, the question of living relatives has taken a turn nobody predicted. For years, researchers assumed Otzi's specific maternal line had gone extinct, that the thin, rare branch of mitochondrial DNA he carried had simply faded out over 50 centuries. Then, updated analysis identified a rare modern connection, suggesting his maternal ancestry did not entirely vanish, but persisted at extremely low frequency somewhere in the modern gene pool. And on the paternal side, a genetic mutation on the Y chromosome, known as GL91, which Ötzi carried, has been traced through population studies to at least 19 living men in Austria who share that same rare male line signature. 19 people alive today who carry a tiny piece of the same ancient machinery that was in Ötzi's cells on the day he was shot. They do not know his name any more than he knew theirs would exist, but the connection is real, traceable, confirmed by the same sequencing technology that corrected his face. The dead man in the ice has living echoes. Here's the thing that makes all of this more than just a fascinating science story. When the first reconstructions were built in the 1990s and early 2000s, the artists had no genome to work from. They had his bones, they had his skull, they had the geographic fact that he was found in the Alps. And for everything the biology could not yet tell them, they reached instinctively for the most familiar template available: the face of the people who found him, the skin of the continent he lay beneath, the hair of the researchers who studied him. Nobody set out to deceive anyone. The artists were filling blanks the science could not yet fill, but in filling them with the familiar, they painted over the real man with something more comfortable. They made him look like an ancestor that modern Europeans could recognize as their own. And that quiet act of projection, repeated across 30 years of museum displays, textbook illustrations, and documentary reconstructions, consumed by millions of people who walked away believing they had met a deep forebear, that act carried a subtle and consequential claim: that Europe's deep past looked like Europe's present, that the ancestors were always pale, that ancestry runs in a clean, unbroken, recognizable line from the Copper Age to today. The corrected genome broke that claim with data. Europe 5,000 years ago was a mosaic of dark-eyed, dark-skinned, lactose-intolerant farmers carrying ancestry from Anatolia, intermingled in different proportions with the ghost genetics of hunter-gatherers who had roamed the continent before them. They were not the ancestors that the comfortable story needed them to be. They were stranger, more varied, more specific, and more human than any museum poster ever captured. And Otzi, the most famous of them all, the man who had been staring out of the glass in Bolzano for 25 years, wearing borrowed pale skin and borrowed dark hair, is now being looked at, again with the face his own cells describe: darker, balder, more particular, more singular. Finally, after 30 years, something closer to himself. The reconstruction in the museum will change. These things always change slowly, the way institutions move, with reluctance and then all at once. A new face will take the place of the old one eventually, browner and stranger and truer, and children who press their hands against the glass will meet a version of him that his killer would actually recognize. Not perfect. Science works in probabilities and error bars, and the honest acknowledgement that certainty is always partial, but closer. And when you have been painted over for 30 years, closer is everything. The ice gave him back to us. The sequencer is giving us back his face, and somewhere in a cold chamber in Bolzano, at the exact temperature of the glacier that held him for 50 centuries, the real man waits with extraordinary patience for the world to finally stop looking at him and seeing itself.